Greetings, it's your host, Gabe Morales, continuing with our series on corrupt cops and corrections, working in America's cities, counties, and states who are doing dirt on the streets, in jails, and in prisons. Today we are going to examine the Baltimore Police Department and some of their biggest corruption scandals to ever hit that agency. To add more credence to my past experience and observations, after one of the more recent scandals, the following statements were made. The community needs to know that when we have evidence of wrongdoing, we will follow that evidence and prosecute you, whether you wear a badge or not, said Maryland U.S. Attorney Robert K. Hurd. Prosecuting law enforcement officers is painful, but necessary if we are going to restore the public's faith, the public's trust in our justice system. No one is above the law. FBI Special Agent in charge of the Baltimore field office, Gordon B. Johnson, added, law enforcement officers are given incredible power to enforce the law and ensure justice. Authority and abuse of this authority is necessary to protect the rights of our citizens and uphold confidence in law enforcement. Anyone who takes advantage of their position for personal gain or in persistence of criminal misconduct must and will be held accountable. First off, let me say once again, while Baltimore may seem to have more than its share of crooked cops and politicians, I'm very sure that there are some real good ones too, working hard for the people of Baltimore. So let's not be so quick to prejudge and paint them all with the same brush. The simple fact is we need more good people to go through the recruiting process with better screening and background checks, for people to step up to the challenge and put on the uniform, and get better and more modern training to change some of the current poor tactics and negative past behaviors if we ever want to change policing and corrections cultures. We need citizens to hold them both accountable and also to give them the proper respect and pay they deserve. So before we get to the details of scandals with the Baltimore Police Department, how about a little background history first on the city and the agency? Baltimore is the most populous city in the state of Maryland. It has a population of almost 600,000 people, according to the 2020 U.S. Census, and it is the 30th most populous city in the United States. The greater Baltimore area has almost 3 million people, making it the 20th largest metropolitan area in the United States. And when combined with the nearby Washington, D.C. area, there is a population of almost 10 million people residing there. Now, many of you are already aware, some of our founding fathers were slave owners, and the state of Maryland was originally a slave state that had some support for succession, but it remained a part of the Union throughout the American Civil War. On February 7, 1904, the Great Baltimore Fire destroyed a good part of the city, as more than 70 blocks of the downtown area burned down. As the city rebuilt, the city's lawyer advocated for an ordinance to bar African Americans from moving into Northwest Baltimore, and the Baltimore Council passed an ordinance that became law in December of 1910 that became the first real estate ordinance of its kind to bar African Americans from certain parts of the city. Many other states soon followed with their own segregation ordinances, although the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against them in 1917. It did not matter, because real estate officials and politicians often secretly agreed to steer blacks away from certain neighborhoods in a process known as redlining. Basically, what they did was take a red pen and circle parts of the city and agree that they would not advertise homes in these areas to blacks, even if they had money. Blacks also found that they often received different treatment from the police department, and this went on for many years. The Baltimore riot of 1968, following the assassination of Martin Luther King in April of 1968, was very violent, and public order was not restored for several days. The uprising cost the city of Baltimore an estimated $10 million, which would be close to $50 million today. Driven by migration, especially from the Deep South, the city's black population grew from almost 24% in 1950 to almost 50% by 1970. White flight to the suburbs occurred all over America, and Baltimore was no different. Soon, previously settled majority white areas became predominantly black neighborhoods. As many of these residents were poor and sometimes drug addicted, crime also rose in those parts of the city, as did reports of police brutality. Even today, Baltimore is considered a very poor city. While according to the U.S. 2020 census, only 11.6% of Americans lived at or below the poverty level, it was closer to 20%, almost double, in Baltimore. The Baltimore City Police Department dates back to 1784. shortly after the 13 colonies were formed. It is often called the Baltimore City Department to differentiate it from the Baltimore County Police Department. Back in the day, like I said, police brutality was common, and questioning police authority was not allowed. Baltimore PD cops could pretty much do whatever they wanted to suspects in the comfort that nobody could really make a major issue out of it for them. Today, the Baltimore Police Department consists of almost 3,000 employees. And during Mayor Martin O'Malley's administration, the department was made of 43% African American officers. But having Black or Latino officers does not always mean better policing for minority communities. In fact, as you will soon see, many of the officers and politicians involved in these scandals were African American. Baltimore PD, whether fairly or unfairly, given that reputation, has been known for being corrupt. During the crack cocaine epidemic, millions of dollars flowed on the streets of America, and it was widely believed that Baltimore PD officers were either on the take or dealing drugs themselves. In the year 2005, former Baltimore PD officers William King and Antonio Murray were arrested by the FBI for federal drug conspiracy charges and ultimately sentenced to 454 years in prison. These guys didn't deal a couple grams here and there. They were dealing in kilo amounts. The investigation was aided by a DVD that circulated around that time called Stop Snitching, in which the two officers who were indicted were shown as examples of untrustworthy police. On July 19, 2011, Officer Daniel G. Redd was also arrested for drug trafficking. While on trial, Redd admitted to being involved in the distribution of large amounts of heroin. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison in September 2012. You would think these very public arrests will at least cause officers to behave short time, but evidently many felt they were untouchable. In May 2012, Police Commissioner Frederick Bilford III directed an investigative unit, including FBI agents, to use wiretaps and break up a crime ring involving multiple police officers that centered on a business called the Majestic Auto Shop. Basically, this auto shop paid a kickback fee to Baltimore PD officers when they called Majestic tow trucks to the scene of an accident. 17 officers pled guilty to charges in that case, with another 37 who were at least suspected or were also involved. But it wasn't just drug dealing or an occasional payoff that Baltimore PD was involved in. In August 2013, Officer Lamin Manet was indicted on charges of acting as a pimp for his own wife and another woman. And in November 2014, he was convicted of the Mann Act, previously known as the White Slave Act of 1910. It was originally used as an easy way for police to arrest Black men who were in the company of unmarried white women, using the general assumption that they must be pimping them out under forced prostitution. Freddie Gray was an African-American man who was hanging out in a known drug area and taken into custody by Baltimore PD on April 12, 2015. For being in the position of a switchblade. While being transported, Gray had what officers later described as a medical emergency. Within an hour of his arrest, Gray had to be taken to the trauma center at a local hospital where it was determined that he suffered a spinal injury. Now, according to his family, Gray's spine was almost severed. This turned out to not be true. However, he had 3 fractured vertebrae and his larynx in his throat was injured. The events that led to his injury in the transportation vehicle are unclear even today. Officers claimed that he was arrested without force or incident. However, dissenting medical professionals indicated that the injuries occurred shortly after the time of his arrest. Despite extensive surgery to try to save his life, Gray died a week after his arrest on April 19th. I recall when this happened, and I remember many police officers felt that there was a rush to judgment because pending investigation, 6 Baltimore police officers were temporarily suspended with pay. Police Commissioner Anthony Batts reported that the officers failed to get proper medical attention to Freddie Gray several times, and they did not buckle him in the van as is required per policy while he was being transported to the police station. The death of Freddie Gray led to the 2015 Baltimore riots. Following Gray's funeral on April 27th, the riot intensified with looting and burning of local businesses.
Once again tonight, across the country, all eyes are focused here on Baltimore, now with palpable unrest as the city begins its first night of curfew after violent clashes between police and protesters. In the wake of the funeral of Freddie Gray, that 25-year-old man who inexplicably died after being injured while in police custody last week, we've seen looting and fires, police cars being targeted, and injuries on both sides as residents demand justice and peace. Tonight's citywide curfew did not start quietly. Minutes into it, police helicopters flew low over protesters, urging them all to go home or face arrest. That's when bottles started flying, and soon officers dressed in riot gear fired what police call pepper balls to disperse the crowd. Relative tranquility amidst palpable tension. Nearly 2,000 National Guard troops are here and lining the streets in what is still a state of emergency. Two major businesses this community has long clamored for. Watch that guy in the gas mask as he sliced the water hose firefighters were using to save the neighborhood. The CVS, the national drugstore chain, all here applauded for opening in this depressed neighborhood, ravaged by fire and looting. This newly built senior citizens high-rise, a $16 million investment, gone. By sunrise, 15 police officers injured. One unresponsive rushed to the hospital in an armored car. When the worst was over, more than 250 people arrested, including 39 juveniles. Like the smell of burning buildings, a stench of sadness and disgust fell over Baltimore.
Just a few days later, on May 1st, the 6 officers who were said to be involved in Freddie Gray's arrest were charged in his death. One officer was charged with second-degree murder, and the other 5 were charged with crimes ranging from involuntary manslaughter to illegal arrest. One of the officers who were prosecuted ended up being involved in a mistrial. 3 of the officers were found not guilty, and the remaining charges against the rest of the officers were dropped in July 2016. Many in the public cried foul and said that there was a cover-up. But we have to remember that police officers, just like anybody else, have the right to due process. So no matter how you feel about it, that was the decision that was carried out. Kevin Davis was commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department from 2015 to 2018. And I'm sure that was a rough time for him, Baltimore police, and the citizens of Baltimore. Following reports, after several investigations, the city, the police department, and the Department of Justice negotiated a consent decree, including placing limits on when and how police can engage with the general public, including individuals suspected of criminal activity. Now, many police officers viewed this as the DOJ tying their hands. And of course, what occurred was something I've spoken about before called depolicing. Many officers said, okay, then we won't arrest anybody unless we have to. This was not good for public safety or officer morale. The DOJ also ordered de-escalation training for officers, especially in dealing with youth, those with mental illness, and when encountering protesters, many who got up in their faces and shouted profanities and threw objects at them. And it also included something that I've always advocated for, better supervisors. In 2016, the DOJ issued a long 163-page report, which condemned many longstanding discriminatory enforcement practices by Baltimore police, especially of African Americans, for very minor offenses, such as jaywalking. The report was very critical of the zero tolerance policy many officers engaged in and disputed many broken windows theory police efforts. To further make my case how depolicing can have effect on communities, Baltimore ended the year 2017 with 343 homicides, the highest ever recorded in that city. The Gun Trace Task Force scandal saw its first indictments in 2017 when 13 officers were accused of robbing Baltimore citizens, stealing and selling drugs, falsifying reports, and overtime hours put in, many times on bogus cases, and then trying to cover it all up. The scandal ringleader was Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, who later admitted to committing multiple armed robberies and stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars in drugs. He was found guilty and was given the harshest punishment of the task force when he received 25 years for his involvement. Fellow task force members Maurice Ward and Evodio Hendricks received 7 years each, but were released in February 2022 after serving less than 5 years of that sentence. Former detectives Daniel Purcell and Marcus Taylor were the only ones among these officers who did not accept a plea bargain. and decided to take their cases to trial. Both got 18-year sentences. Officer Jamel Rayam received 12 years. Officer Momodu Gondu received 10 years. Sergeant Thomas Ehlers, another supervisor of the group, received 15 years. And in 2018, a fired former Philadelphia and BPD officer Eric Snell pled guilty just 3 days into his trial that he conspired to sell drugs with corrupt members of the Gun Trace Task Force, and he faced nearly 20 years in prison. In the end, the Gun Trace Task Force scandal ended up costing taxpayers more than $13 million in settlements, with victims involving hundreds of cases put together by these corrupt cops, which were thrown out. And of course, while the monetary damage was serious, the damage to the already poor reputation of Baltimore PD cannot be described in words. In February 2021, Detective Victor Rivera was sentenced to 14 months confinement for his role in stealing 3 kilos of cocaine, then using a police informant to sell the contraband. In a police department that has had the worst kinds of challenges and scandals, this is the last thing the people of Baltimore and its officers needed, stated David Harris, who researches police behavior as a professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. On May 10, 2018, the newly appointed Baltimore Police Commissioner, Daryl De Sosa, was charged in U.S. District Court on 3 misdemeanor counts of failing to file federal income taxes for the years 2013, 14, and 15. Then Baltimore Mayor Catherine Pugh initially expressed a lot of confidence in De Sosa, but a day later, she suspended him pending resolution of the court charges. He ended up resigning a few days later. But police were not the only ones in Baltimore to be corrupt. Pugh herself later pled guilty to corruption, a day after federal prosecutors unsealed an indictment accusing her of using a fraudulent children's book business to enrich herself and further fuel her political career. Pugh took office in 2016, and when faced with the charges, she took a plea bargain and pled guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and conspiracy to defraud the government, as well as 2 counts of income tax evasion. Before Pugh, Sheila Dixon was mayor of Baltimore from 2007 to 2010. But in early 2009, she was indicted on 12 felony and misdemeanor counts, including perjury, theft, and other misconduct. At the end of the year, she was found guilty of one of those counts and resigned from office. In 2015, Dixon made a comeback effort to become mayor of Baltimore again, and she was the front runner until 2016, when Congressman Elijah Cummings endorsed candidate Catherine Pugh in 2016, who was voted into office but later fell in disgrace. Now, the current mayor of Baltimore, a relatively young guy named Brandon Scott, was elected in office, narrowly defeating Sheila Dixon, who almost won in despite of her criminal record. In 2022, Scott proposed a $5 million increase in the city's police budget, which was immediately met with criticism from the far left. In January 2022, Scott implemented the Group Violence Reduction Strategy in the city's West Police District, which had experienced a lot of crime. This program was set to target individuals who are likely to be victims or perpetrators of gun violence within the city. The strategy stresses community-based policing principles. Scott's program appeared to be effective, as by the end of 2022, Scott stated that the district had seen almost a 1/3 decrease in gun violence. Now, when I first started this episode, I had planned to also delve into the Baltimore City Jail, which has experienced a lot of corruption amongst officers, but there's just not enough time this time around. Perhaps I'll do an episode on that in the future. Meanwhile, if you're interested in knowing more about those cases, you can see an episode on this channel I did previously on the Black Guerrilla family, which mentions the Baltimore City Jail. Or you can read my book on the BGF that also includes that subject. And lastly, I'd like to give a shout out to the positive people and positive forces with the Black Law Enforcement Association of Washington, also known as BLUE. Some members who have ties to the East Coast, including my brother and past president, Carlos Bratcher. I also send regards to Sister Cynthia Softly of the Washington Department of Corrections, who has also worked hard with the community to improve relations via BLUE. And I don't want to forget my sisters Faye Brooks and Carmen Best, and many other great leaders with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement, or NOBLE, who work hard to improve professionalism in policing today. Hope you found this episode to be interesting and that it helps educate you on why we need better police and better policing in America. For now, this is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.